I never considered myself superstitious. I've always been the rational type, the one who laughs at ghost stories, scoffs at paranormal shows on TV, and shakes my head when friends swear they've experienced something otherworldly. That is, until last summer when everything I believed about reality, about what's real and what isn't, was shaken to its core. It was late July, right around my grandfather's birthday. Grandpa Tom had passed away a little over a year ago, and I'd been meaning to visit his grave. I don't know why it felt so important that day, maybe guilt. I hadn't visited his grave since the funeral. Life had gotten busy, you know how it goes. But that day, something urged me to go. Maybe it was the date itself or the gloomy weather adding to the melancholic atmosphere, but I felt this pull. Like I had to go. It was raining lightly, a constant drizzle that gave the sky a dull gray hue. The roads were slick, and the clouds hung low. As I pulled into the cemetery, a deep fog began rolling in, thick and heavy, giving everything a surreal, eerie quality. I remember looking at the clock in my car. It was 3:17 in the afternoon, not that late, but the storm clouds made it feel much later. I parked my car near the entrance and grabbed the bouquet of flowers I had bought earlier that day. Walking through the rows of headstones, the rain dripped off my jacket hood, and the mist seemed to cling to my skin. The cemetery was dead silent, no pun intended. The only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the trees and the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I found Grandpa Tom's grave easily. His headstone was modest, just his name, the dates, and a simple inscription. Beloved husband, father, and friend. As I knelt down to place the flowers, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. He had been a huge part of my life growing up. The memories of fishing trips, his deep belly laugh, and how he'd always tell me that no matter how tough life gets, I had to face it head on. I stood there for a while, just letting the rain fall around me. I said a few quiet words to him, nothing too sentimental, just talking like I used to when he was alive. I don't know how long I stood there, but something made me look up. That's when I saw him. Across the rows of graves, standing maybe 3 or 4 rows away, was an old man. At first I thought nothing of it. It's a cemetery, after all, other people visit their loved ones too. But then I noticed something strange. He was standing still, almost unnaturally still, facing directly towards me. The rain poured down, but the man didn't move an inch. He just stood there, watching. I squinted, trying to make out his features through the mist. My heart skipped a beat. The man looked exactly like my grandpa. Same old-fashioned wool coat, same fedora hat, even the same slight hunch in his shoulders. But it couldn't be him. I shook my head, told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone who just happened to look like him. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. When I looked back, the man was gone. Vanished like he had never been there. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly finished my prayers and walked back to the car, trying to push the thought out of my mind. It's nothing, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild. But as I drove out of the cemetery, that uneasy feeling didn't leave me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I couldn't shake the image of that old man, the way he had stared, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. I told myself I just had a weird moment. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the rain and the fog were playing tricks on my eyes. I turned on the radio to distract myself, flipping through stations until I found one playing some old classic rock. That was better. I hummed along, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly begin to ease. But then, as I was driving down a narrow road that cut through the woods, a shortcut I often took, something happened that I still can't explain. I saw him again. At first, it was just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the rain and fog. My heart leaped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. I looked out the window, and there he was, standing just off the road, half hidden by the trees. It was Grandpa Tom. Or at least, it looked like him. I stared, frozen in place. My mind was racing. It can't be him, he's dead, this is impossible. But there he was. The same old coat, the same hat, even the same tired, sad expression on his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me with that same penetrating gaze. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. But then, something even stranger happened. As quickly as he appeared, he was gone. One moment he was there, the next, the road was empty. I let out a shaky breath and tried to steady my hands on the steering wheel. My head was spinning, my thoughts racing. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure: I needed to get home. As I continued down the road, my mind struggled to make sense of everything. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was so caught up in my emotions over visiting his grave that my brain was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. That wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I'd seen him. I knew I had. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, barely aware of the road, my knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. But it didn't last long. That night, I would come to realize that this was only the beginning. That night, I went to bed early. My body was exhausted from the drive, the weather, and of course, whatever the hell had happened that day. I was trying to convince myself it was all just stress. Grief can mess with your head, right? I kept telling myself that over and over. But no matter how much I rationalized it, the uneasy feeling from earlier clung to me like the dampness from the rain. I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft hum of the rain outside my window, my eyes wide open. The room was cold, colder than usual. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but the chill seemed to sink into my bones. I tossed and turned, trying to shake off the nagging fear that had settled deep in my gut. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep, though it felt like I was barely unconscious. Then it happened. I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest, to the sound of my phone ringing. Disoriented, I fumbled around on my nightstand, knocking over a glass of water before finally grabbing my phone. I squinted at the screen. 2:14 a.m. The caller ID read unknown. I almost didn't answer it. Who calls at this hour? But a strange sense of urgency made me swipe the screen. Hello? My voice was groggy, shaky even. I could barely hear anything at first. Just static, the kind you get when an old radio struggles to find a signal. I sat up, wide awake now, straining to listen. Then, through the crackling static, I heard it, a voice. A voice I knew. A voice I hadn't heard in over a year. David. It was my grandfather. There was no mistaking it. It was his voice, clear as day, cutting through the static for just a brief second. My entire body went cold. My heart felt like it had stopped. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice barely a whisper. Grandpa? The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, staring at my phone, my mind racing. I checked the call log. It was real. The call had happened, but the number was still listed as unknown. I tried calling it back, but the call wouldn't go through. It was like the number didn't exist. My hands were shaking as I set the phone back down. I wanted to believe it was a dream, but I was too awake, too alert. My heart was still hammering in my chest. I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, as if they were moving ever so slightly. I could feel something, or someone, watching me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as some kind of bizarre prank. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the strange encounter at the cemetery. But a part of me knew better. There was no mistaking his voice. I knew it like I knew my own name. I decided to call my cell provider to see if they could trace the number, just to have some peace of mind. But when I explained the situation to the woman on the other end of the line, she told me there was no record of the call. No incoming call had been registered at 2:14 a.m., or at any time during the night for that matter. I hung up the phone, my stomach twisting into knots. If the call didn't exist, then how had I heard him? I was beginning to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere, stuck on that phone call and the image of Grandpa Tom standing by the side of the road. By evening, I was a nervous wreck. Every little noise made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind rustling outside the window, everything felt amplified, like the house was alive with a presence I couldn't see. I knew I had to go back to the cemetery. As much as the thought terrified me, something deep inside told me that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop until I did. So that evening, just before sunset, I found myself driving back to the graveyard, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I made my way down the same road I had driven just a day before. The cemetery looked different in the fading light. The fog had returned, thick and heavy, swirling through the headstones like it had been waiting for me. I parked my car and hesitated for a moment, staring out at the rows of graves. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the cemetery itself was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I stepped out of the car and made my way to Grandpa Tom's grave. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I stood in front of his headstone, the bouquet of flowers I had left yesterday now wilting and soggy from the rain. I didn't know what I expected to happen. Maybe some kind of sign, something that would give me an answer to the strange events of the past 24 hours. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the fog, and the weight of this silence pressing down on me. I knelt down, my knees sinking into the wet grass. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If you're here, if you're trying to tell me something, please just give me a sign. I don't understand what's happening." For a moment, nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself, feeling ridiculous for talking to an empty grave. But then, just as I was about to stand up, the air around me shifted. The temperature dropped, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt it, a presence, standing right behind me. I froze. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, watching, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what, or who, was standing there. But I had to. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart hammering in my chest. There, just a few feet away, was a figure. A shadowy silhouette standing among the graves, barely visible through the thick fog. But even in the dim light, I knew who it was. It was Grandpa Tom. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me with that same sad, knowing expression I had seen before. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the ghost of the man who had raised me. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The fog seemed to close in around me, suffocating, pressing against my skin. I bolted back to my car, my legs shaky, barely able to breathe. I didn't stop running until I was inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the fog, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I don't know what's real anymore. I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't scare easily. I've watched countless horror movies, gone through haunted houses with little more than a laugh, and even stayed overnight in supposedly haunted hotels without feeling so much as a chill. But what happened to me one summer night a few years ago changed all of that. I've never told many people this story because, honestly, I'm not sure if they believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I even believe it sometimes. But it happened. And no matter how much I try to forget it, the memory haunts me. It was the summer I turned 19. My best friend, Ethan, and I had just graduated from high school, and we were in that strange in-between space where you're not quite sure what to do with your life, but you know you want to make the most of your freedom before it slips away. Ethan was always the adventurous type, the kind of guy who loved to explore abandoned places, sneak into places we weren't supposed to be, and test the limits of how far we could push our luck. And one day, he came up with an idea that would lead us straight into the most terrifying experience of our lives. Have you heard about the old cemetery on Elm Road? Ethan asked me one afternoon while we were sitting in his garage, bored out of our minds. It was sweltering hot outside, one of those summer days where it feels like the air itself is trying to smother you. I hadn't. Elm Road was on the outskirts of town, a stretch of road surrounded by thick woods and farmland, with nothing much to offer except a sense of isolation. Apparently, there was an old cemetery there that no one visited anymore. Ethan said it was small, just a patch of land with maybe 100 or so graves, most of them from the 1800s. But there were rumors about it, rumors that people had seen strange figures lurking in the trees, and that the place had a dark history, something to do with witchcraft or occult rituals. Sounds like bullshit to me, I said, leaning back in my chair. But Ethan's eyes had that glint, the one that meant he was serious about checking it out. Come on, man. Let's just go and take a look. It'll be fun. I hesitated. Something about the idea didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was just my gut telling me not to mess with things I didn't understand, but I wasn't eager to go wandering around some forgotten graveyard. But Ethan was persuasive, as always. After another hour of back and forth, I found myself reluctantly agreeing. We planned to go that night, under the cover of darkness. Ethan's logic was that it would be easier to sneak in without being seen. The cemetery was technically private property, and the last thing we needed was to get caught trespassing. The place was surrounded by a tall, wrought iron fence, the kind that looked like it belonged in some gothic horror novel, with sharp spikes on top and vines crawling up the bars. The only way in, aside from the front gate, was through a path that cut through the woods on the cemetery's far side. By the time we arrived, the sun had set, and the only light came from the sliver of moon hanging in the sky. The trees around the cemetery loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I remember standing there, staring at the gate, feeling that first twinge of unease. I should have trusted my instincts and turned back, but Ethan was already making his way toward the tree line. Come on, man. It's just a bunch of old graves. What's the worst that could happen? I followed him. We crept through the woods, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, seemed amplified. After a few minutes, we reached the back of the cemetery. Ethan gave me a grin and vaulted over the fence. I hesitated again but eventually followed him, the metal cold and rough under my hands. Inside, the cemetery looked even more eerie than I'd imagined. The gravestones were old and weathered, many of them cracked or leaning at odd angles. Some were so worn that you couldn't even read the names on them anymore. Others had fallen over completely, half buried in the earth. The grass was overgrown, weeds sprouting up between the stones, and the whole place felt abandoned, like no one had cared about it for decades. We wandered through the rows of graves in silence. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, certain that I'd see someone, or something, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. But there was never anything there. Then we saw the house. It stood at the far end of the cemetery, a crumbling two-story structure that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were dark, some of them broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. The place gave off an aura of decay, like it had been abandoned for so long that it was slowly being reclaimed by the earth. But more than that, it felt wrong. Like the air around it was colder, heavier. I was about to suggest we leave when I saw it. In one of the upstairs windows, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a shadowy shape, standing there, watching us. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my eyes locked on the window. "What the hell?" I whispered. Ethan must have seen the look on my face because he followed my gaze. But by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low, but tinged with excitement. Something. I don't know. In the window. It was watching us." Ethan grinned. "We have to check it out." "No way," I said, backing away from the house. "We should get out of here. Now." But Ethan was already walking toward the house, ignoring my protests. I didn't want to be left alone in that place, so I reluctantly followed him, my heart racing. The closer we got to the house, the worse the feeling of dread became. It felt like the air was thickening, like something terrible was waiting inside. We reached the front porch, and Ethan pushed the door open with a loud creak. I stayed behind him, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. Not yet. And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, we heard it, a voice. A low, guttural growl that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Get out." That voice, I'll never forget how it sounded. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, guttural, and filled with a malice that pierced the air around us. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. But one look at Ethan told me he heard it too. His face, usually cocky and full of reckless energy, had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I could already feel the sense of dread building inside me, like some invisible weight pressing down on my chest. But Ethan, in typical fashion, refused to back down. He forced a shaky grin, trying to laugh off the terror. "It's probably just the wind, man. Or an echo or something. You're jumping at shadows." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted so badly to believe it was just some trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. That voice, it felt too real. Too directed. Like it was aimed right at us. Still, for whatever reason, pride, stubbornness, or maybe just the bond we had, I couldn't leave him there alone. So I followed. We stepped inside the house, the floor creaking beneath our feet as if it might collapse at any moment. The air was thick, musty, and stale, and there was a strange smell that I couldn't quite place, something damp and rotten, like old wood and decay. The walls were cracked, the wallpaper peeling, and debris littered the floor, broken furniture, shattered glass, and what looked like the remnants of old candles, melted into long, twisted shapes. There were symbols drawn on the walls in what appeared to be red paint. At least, I hoped it was paint. Pentagrams, strange markings, and other occult symbols I didn't recognize covered nearly every surface. It looked like the place had been used for some kind of ritual, and I could feel the energy in the air, dark and oppressive. "Ethan, we need to get out of here," I said again, my voice trembling. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was staring at something on the floor near the center of the room. When I followed his gaze, my stomach turned. It was a large, intricate symbol, a pentagram, surrounded by circles and strange markings, scrawled in what looked like ash. Around it were scattered a dozen or so small dolls, their faces crudely stitched and their eyes replaced with buttons. They were positioned in a way that made them look like they were staring directly at us. "Dude, this is messed up," I muttered, taking a step back. My body was screaming for me to run, to leave Ethan and get the hell out of there. Ethan knelt down, examining the symbols. This is some kind of occult shit, right? I think I've seen something like this online before." He reached out as if to touch one of the dolls, and that's when it happened. The temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew icy, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Ethan must have felt it too because he yanked his hand back, his face going even paler. The voice came again, clearer this time, and more menacing. "Get out." It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the wind. It was real, and it was coming from somewhere deep within the house. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the two of us, and the suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. That's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway that led to the back of the house was a man. Or at least, I think it was a man. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light around him, his face partially obscured by shadow. But what I could see was enough to freeze me in place. His eyes, cold, dark, and filled with hatred, were locked onto mine, and a thin, twisted smile spread across his lips. "Get out of my house," he growled. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd turned to lead, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. Ethan was the first to react. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. We have to go, now! We bolted, sprinting out of the house and into the graveyard, my head spinning. But it wasn't over. Not even close. As we ran, I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate, like someone, or something, was chasing us. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting out of there. The trees seemed to close in around us as we stumbled through the woods, our breath coming in ragged gasps. We reached the fence, and I scrambled over it as fast as I could, my hands slipping on the metal. Ethan was right behind me, and as soon as we hit the ground on the other side, we ran for the car. But just as we reached the edge of the woods, I heard it again. The voice, louder this time, angry and demanding. You can't leave! A hand, cold, strong, and impossibly real, grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I screamed, kicking wildly, trying to break free. Ethan turned, his eyes wide with terror, as he saw me struggling. For a moment, I thought he was going to leave me. I could see the fear in his face, the instinct to run, to save himself. But he didn't. He lunged forward, grabbing my arms and pulling me with all his strength. I felt the grip on my ankle loosen, and suddenly I was free. We both sprinted to the car, throwing ourselves inside, and Ethan gunned the engine. As we sped away, I looked back through the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the cemetery, was the man in the black coat, his eyes still locked onto mine. He didn't move. He didn't chase us. But I knew he wasn't done with us. We didn't say a word the entire drive back to Ethan's house. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had just happened. When we finally pulled into his driveway, Ethan turned to me, his hand still shaking on the steering wheel. We can't tell anyone about this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No one will believe us. I nodded. He was right. No one would believe us. But that didn't make it any less real. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the black coat, his eyes burning into mine. And then there were the dreams, dark, twisted nightmares of being trapped in that house, of hearing that voice telling me I could never leave. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that we had gotten spooked by some old house and our minds had played tricks on us. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. A week after it happened, Ethan stopped answering my calls. I went to his house to check on him, but his mom said he'd left town, gone to stay with a relative in another state. I never saw him again after that. To this day, I'm not sure what happened to him. Maybe he just needed to get away. Or maybe something else happened. It was early October, one of those nights when the air feels crisp but not cold enough to see your breath. The sky was clear, full of stars, but there was this biting wind that made you zip up your jacket tighter than usual. My friend Gavin and I were into metal, like hardcore, head-banging stuff. We'd been in a band together for years, playing dive bars and garages, thinking one day we'd make it big. But that night, it wasn't about music. We were just bored out of our minds. The town we lived in, Brantfield, was small, almost desolate, especially after 10 p.m. Most of the places shut down, leaving the streets empty, and for a couple of guys looking for something to do at 3 a.m., that was the worst. I remember Gavin saying, "Let's just go for a drive, clear our heads." And that sounded like a good idea at the time. We hopped in my old Ford, blasted some old Slayer albums, and drove aimlessly through the empty streets. After about an hour of driving and shouting along to the music, we found ourselves near the old part of town, where the buildings were mostly from the 1800s. It was that part of Brantfield no one really went to anymore. In the middle of it all was this cemetery, Silver Oak Cemetery. It was huge, sprawling across both sides of the old town square, separated by a rusty iron fence that had probably been there as long as the graves themselves. The left side was the newer section, where the headstones were neat, polished, and more recent. But it was the right side that caught our attention, the older part of the cemetery. It was overgrown, with gravestones that had been weathered down by centuries of rain, wind, and neglect. "I bet no one's been in there in years," Gavin said, pointing to the old section as we parked. "Wanna check it out?" I hesitated for a second, but you know how it is with best friends. If one of you is up for it, the other doesn't want to back down. So we grabbed our phones, just to have some light, and headed towards the entrance. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the silence of the night. As soon as we stepped inside, there was this stillness. Not just the kind of quiet you get in the early hours of the morning, but a heavier kind, like the whole place was holding its breath. We walked through rows of ancient tombstones, some tilted and cracked, others almost completely swallowed by the earth. Moss and ivy had claimed most of them, and a few had carvings so worn down you couldn't read the names anymore. We were talking, cracking jokes to break the eerie silence, but I noticed Gavin wasn't laughing as much as usual. He seemed distracted, like he was watching something out of the corner of his eye. I didn't mention it. I just figured it was the creepy atmosphere getting to him, because it sure as hell was getting to me. At some point, we found ourselves near a huge pecan tree, its bare branches twisting against the moonlit sky like skeletal fingers. The tree stood at the center of the cemetery, towering over everything else, casting long, dark shadows. It felt like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, but we were still laughing it off, taking pictures of old gravestones as if we were in some sort of twisted sightseeing tour. We were sitting under the tree, catching our breath, when we heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, this faint, almost playful sound, like a child laughing. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the wind. It was distinct. A giggle. High-pitched, like a little girl's. Gavin and I stopped talking. We looked at each other, waiting for one of us to crack a joke, but neither of us did. I remember Gavin glancing around, his eyes scanning the dark, misty edges of the graveyard. "Did you hear that?" he finally asked, his voice lower, more serious than usual. "Yeah," I replied, my throat tightening. "Probably just some stupid toy left by a grave or something. Like one of those motion-activated things." I said it, but I didn't believe it. There were no fresh graves here, no decorations. This part of the cemetery was dead, in every sense of the word. Still, we tried to shake it off, laughing nervously, pretending like we didn't just hear something we couldn't explain. Minutes passed, and that feeling of being watched started creeping up on me. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to nerves, but it got stronger, more pressing. It felt like eyes were on us, from every shadow, every corner. Then Gavin spoke again, his voice shaky this time. "Dude, I think I saw someone." He pointed toward the tree line at the far end of the cemetery, where the woods began. "Over there, near the trees." I stared in the direction he was pointing, but all I saw were swaying branches and the moonlight casting strange shapes on the ground. But Gavin wasn't joking. He was pale, his eyes wide, like he was really seeing something. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just the wind, man. We're freaking ourselves out for no reason." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The wind picked up again, and I heard the giggle once more, this time louder. Closer. And it wasn't just a giggle anymore. There was something else, like footsteps, crunching softly on the dead leaves behind us. We both stood up, our hearts racing, glancing nervously around us. "Let's get out of here," I muttered, more to myself than to Gavin. He didn't argue. We started walking quickly back toward the gate, but the faster we walked, the louder the sounds got, footsteps, laughter, like something was following us. When we hit the gate, we were practically sprinting. I fumbled with my car keys, hands shaking, and finally, we threw ourselves into the car, slamming the doors shut. For a second, we just sat there, breathing heavily, looking out at the cemetery, expecting to see, I don't know, something. Someone. But there was nothing. The place looked exactly the same as when we first walked in, dead, quiet, untouched. I started the car, throwing it into reverse. We were pulling away when Gavin said, "Look behind us." I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it. The back door of the car, slowly swinging open. Neither of us had touched it. It had been locked, I was sure of it. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding out of my chest. We jumped out, staring at the door, then at each other, both of us too freaked out to speak. The door shouldn't have opened. There was no reason for it to be unlocked, let alone wide open. We slammed it shut and sped off, not saying a word until we were miles away from the cemetery. But that was only the beginning. The rest of the drive was a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, barely paying attention to the road. My mind raced with thoughts of what just happened. Gavin was quiet, too, his eyes darting nervously around as if expecting to see something creeping up beside the car. The night felt heavier now, like it was closing in on us. We finally pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering like a weak pulse. It felt safe in the bright light, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The door creaked open, and a wave of cold air hit us as we got out. Gavin looked like he was about to be sick. I wanted to laugh it off, but the image of that open car door kept replaying in my mind, an echo of something we couldn't explain. "Let's just check the car," I suggested, hoping to reassure him. "Make sure nothing's messed up." We circled around to the back of my Ford. The night air felt electric, charged with an unspoken tension that hung between us. I could feel the unease radiating off Gavin like heat. As I reached for the handle of the trunk, Gavin stood back, staring at the tree line surrounding the gas station. "Man, I really don't like this," he muttered. "Something feels off." "Come on, it's just a gas station," I said, but I felt the hairs on my neck prickling too. I shrugged it off, hoping that the fresh air would clear my head. But as I opened the trunk, my stomach dropped. Everything was in order, our gear, my guitar case, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain. "Dude, look!" I called out, and Gavin stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. There, nestled among our gear, was a small, old-fashioned doll. Its glassy eyes seemed to glint in the fluorescent light, and its dress was dusty and tattered, like it had been buried in the earth for ages. "Where did that come from?" Gavin whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "We didn't put that there, right?" "No way. I would have seen it," I replied, a chill running down my spine. I reached for the doll, my fingers brushing against its cold surface. It felt oddly heavy, like it held something within. I quickly dropped it back into the trunk, a wave of nausea washing over me. "Let's just go," Gavin said, stepping back, his face pale. "I don't like this. This whole night has been messed up." I nodded in agreement. We climbed back into the car, and I locked the doors, the comforting sound echoing in the silence. I could feel the unease settling between us like a thick fog. The laughter from the cemetery replayed in my mind, mingling with the image of that doll. As I drove back toward town, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, lurking behind us. But the road was empty, lined with shadows cast by trees. The gas station slowly faded from view, and as we drove further away, the tension began to ease, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Let's just get some food or something," I suggested, trying to break the silence. "Maybe we're just imagining things." "It was a creepy place." Gavin nodded, but I could see he was still on edge. We pulled into a diner that was open 24 hours, its neon sign buzzing softly. It was a relief to be in a well-lit place, surrounded by the comforting smell of coffee and greasy food. We ordered burgers and fries, trying to act like everything was normal, but it felt forced. The laughter from earlier lingered in the back of my mind, like a bad aftertaste I couldn't wash away. As we sat in the booth, I caught a glimpse of the old jukebox in the corner. It was one of those vintage models, the kind that played classic rock and blues. Something about it caught my eye, and I found myself staring at it. The lights on the jukebox flickered, and I could swear I heard a faint melody, one I couldn't quite place. "Dude, are you alright?" Gavin asked, breaking my trance. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, shaking my head to clear the fog. But the music wouldn't leave me alone. I could hear it, just beneath the chatter of the diner. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, mixed with the laughter from the cemetery. When our food arrived, we dug in, the warmth of the burgers grounding us, but I still felt off. "What do you think that was back there?" I asked, taking a bite. "I don't know, man," Gavin replied, his brow furrowed. "I think we should just forget about it. It's probably nothing." But I knew better. The unease was gnawing at me. It didn't feel like nothing. The way the door opened, the doll, it all felt wrong. We finished our meal in silence, the laughter and chatter around us fading into the background. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us from that cemetery, that it was somehow still with us. When we finally left the diner, the air felt different, heavier, charged with an unseen presence. The drive home was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft music playing on the radio. I glanced at Gavin, who was staring out the window, his expression distant. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" I asked half-jokingly, but deep down, I hoped we wouldn't. "Not if I can help it," Gavin replied, shaking his head. "That place gives me the creeps." When we finally pulled up to my house, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But as I stepped out of the car, that familiar chill crept back in. I glanced around the yard, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "I'll see you later," I said, trying to shake off the feeling as we parted ways. As I walked into my house, I flipped on the lights, and everything felt normal again. The sounds of the night outside faded as I closed the door, locking it behind me. I thought about the doll, the laughter, the footsteps, and suddenly, I felt exhausted. I climbed into bed, hoping to drift off into a dreamless sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. I pulled the covers up over my head, trying to block out the sounds. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I rubbed my eyes and picked it up. It was a text from Gavin. "Dude, I just checked my phone. I have a video from earlier tonight. You have to see this." Curiosity piqued. I sat up and opened the message. The video played in grainy quality, showing us walking through the cemetery, laughing and joking. But then it changed. As we approached the old tree, the laughter echoed in the background. Suddenly, the camera shifted, panning toward the treeling. In the corner of the frame, something moved, too quick to catch clearly, but it was there. A shadow, darting between the trees. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, heart pounding in my chest. Just then, I heard a soft giggle, the same one from the cemetery, echoing in my room. I froze, the phone slipping from my fingers. I felt a chill creep down my spine, as if a cold breeze had swept through the room, despite the windows being shut tight. I stood up slowly, glancing around my darkened room. My breath caught in my throat as I caught sight of something, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering in the hallway. I rushed to the door, throwing it open, my heart racing as I stepped into the darkened corridor. "Gavin!" I called, but there was no answer. Just silence. I crept down the hall, every step feeling heavier, the air thick with tension. I reached the living room and flicked on the light. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt it again, eyes watching from the shadows. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the flickering shadows cast by the overhead light. The laughter echoed again, louder this time, a chilling melody that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away, heart racing, until I hit the wall behind me. That's when I saw it, the doll. It was sitting in the middle of the living room floor, where I had left it, its glassy eyes reflecting the light. "No way," I whispered, fear coursing through me. I hadn't moved it, but there it was, grinning up at me, as if it had a secret only it knew. Before I could think, I turned and ran, throwing open the front door and racing into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the street, my lungs burning, fear clawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had disturbed that night in the cemetery was following me home. And now, it was in my house, waiting for me in the shadows, just like it had waited for us in Silver Oak Cemetery. And to this day, I still feel it. Whenever I close my eyes at night, I hear that laughter, soft and sweet, yet so sinister. It haunts my dreams, creeping into my mind and refusing to let go. So, if you ever find yourself wandering through an old cemetery, especially in the dead of night, just remember this: sometimes, the things we disturb don't just stay buried. Sometimes, they follow you home. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and I manage Crestwood Cemetery, a quiet patch of land on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. The cemetery isn't anything special, a mix of old and new graves, a few impressive family plots, and a crumbling mausoleum at the far end. People come here for the same reasons they go to any other cemetery: to mourn, to remember, and then to leave. But there was something about the Weatherford family that lingered. They weren't like the others. And what happened on the day of the funeral, and the days that followed, made me question everything I thought I knew about this place. It all started on a Wednesday morning in early November. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. The leaves had turned to a muddy gold, carpeting the cemetery grounds in a thick layer. I remember it vividly because that was the morning I first met Lucas Weatherford. Lucas arrived at the cemetery office just as I was going over paperwork for another upcoming service. He must have been around 32 or 33, tall but slightly hunched, as if the weight of the world had settled onto his shoulders. His eyes were bloodshot, and I could tell he hadn't slept in days. He was there to arrange a plot for his father, who, as he told me, was in hospice care and didn't have much time left. I've seen all kinds of grief in this job, but something about Lucas made me uneasy from the start. He was polite, almost overly so, but there was a desperation in his voice, a kind of franticness that set me on edge. He carried with him an old leather satchel, which he clutched tightly, as if it held something precious. "I need a plot for my father," he said, barely meeting my eyes as he spoke. "He doesn't have long, and I just want to make sure everything's in place." I showed him a few available plots near the east side of the cemetery, a quiet spot near a large oak tree. Lucas seemed to approve, though he barely glanced at the area. He was more interested in the paperwork, signing every document with shaky hands. As he worked through the forms, he pulled out a few old photographs from his satchel and laid them on my desk. They were pictures of his father, a frail old man with a kind smile and watery blue eyes. There was something endearing about him, something that made me think of my own father, who had passed away years ago. Lucas lingered for a while after the paperwork was done, just sitting in the office with me in awkward silence. At one point, he asked if he could walk through the cemetery for a bit. I told him it was fine, of course, and he wandered off into the sea of gravestones. That evening, after he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole interaction. But the work kept me busy, and I filed it away in the back of my mind. A few days later, Lucas's father passed. The call came early in the morning, and Lucas requested a simple graveside service. It was set for the following Friday, a day that would be etched into my memory for reasons I couldn't have anticipated. The day of the funeral, the weather turned sour. What had been a gray, misty morning quickly shifted to a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the cemetery like a living thing, shaking the old trees and sending leaves swirling in frantic circles. By the time the procession arrived, the rain had started in earnest, turning the ground to slick mud. I remember standing under the awning of the office as the hearse pulled in. Lucas was there, sitting in the front seat, staring straight ahead with that same haunted look. As the pallbearers moved the casket to the gravesite, Lucas stepped out of the car and stood silently by, his head bowed. There weren't many mourners, just a handful of people who I assumed were family or close friends. The ceremony was short, almost hurried, as the wind whipped through the cemetery and the rain fell harder. I stayed back, watching from a distance as the casket was lowered into the ground. There was something about the scene that unsettled me, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until Lucas stood by the grave, long after the others had left, that I began to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was muttering to himself, or maybe to his father, I couldn't tell. The words were too quiet, lost to the sound of the storm. But his expression was what caught my attention. It wasn't sadness or grief. It was fear. I don't know how long he stood there. Eventually, I retreated to my office, more than ready to be done with the day. As I began wrapping things up, I glanced out the window toward the cemetery, just in time to see something that chilled me to the bone. Between the rows of gravestones, a figure moved, a man, walking briskly, almost unnaturally, through the rain. At first I thought it was one of the mourners, perhaps someone returning to pay their respects. But as I watched, the figure moved erratically, darting in and out of the shadows. I grabbed my flashlight and raincoat, deciding to go out and make sure everything was in order. But by the time I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure, there was no one there. Just rows of silent gravestones and the relentless downpour. I was soaked to the bone when I finally made my way back to the office. As I opened the door, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut, hard enough to make the windows rattle. I froze, my heart pounding. There was no one else here, and the cemetery gates had been locked after the last car had left. For a moment, I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Then I saw him. Through the rain-splattered window, standing by the old mausoleum, was a man, an older man, dressed in a dark, tattered coat. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I recognized him instantly. He was Lucas's father, the man I'd seen in the photographs. But that was impossible. He was dead, buried just hours ago. Before I could react, the figure turned and walked behind the mausoleum, disappearing into the shadows. I ran outside, calling out, my voice lost in the storm. But there was no one there. When I finally returned to the office, soaked and shaken, I sat at my desk, staring at the rain as it lashed against the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. But I told myself it was just the exhaustion, the stress of the day getting to me. Still, deep down, I knew that I had seen something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that what I saw that night could be chalked up to exhaustion or a trick of the mind brought on by the storm. But as the days passed, the strange events around the cemetery only grew worse. The morning after the Weatherford funeral, I returned to Crestwood like I always did, a hot cup of coffee in hand and a list of tasks to check off. But something was different. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and as I drove through the cemetery gates, I noticed that the place felt emptier than usual. Not physically, of course. The graves were still there, the trees still swayed in the wind. But it was like the cemetery itself had shifted, as though the earth beneath the graves had exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long. I parked my truck near the maintenance shed and set about doing my usual rounds. But from the moment I stepped out of the vehicle, I could feel eyes on me. I turned more than once, thinking I might catch someone watching from behind a tree or hiding among the gravestones, but there was no one. Just the usual rows of markers and the faint rustling of leaves. I made my way to the fresh grave where Lucas Weatherford's father had been buried. The soil had settled slightly, but everything looked as it should. I stood there for a while, staring at the simple headstone with his name etched into the granite, George Weatherford, 1948 to 2023. As I stood there, that same feeling from the day of the funeral crept up my spine, the sense that something was watching me. This time, it felt stronger, more tangible. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered like a shadow. Then, the phone calls started. It was late that evening when the first one came. I had just sat down for dinner with my wife, Rachel. We live in a small house about a mile from the cemetery, close enough to keep an eye on things but far enough that I could escape the gloom of it when I needed to. My phone rang just as we were about to dig into a quiet meal, and I almost ignored it, thinking it was just a telemarketer. But something made me pick up. "Mr. Whitmore?" The voice on the other end was trembling, barely above a whisper. "Yes, this is Daniel." "Who is this?" "It's Lucas Weatherford." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. After the funeral, most families take some time before they reach out again, usually to finalize paperwork or arrange for a marker. But there was something wrong in Lucas's voice. He sounded frantic. I need to come by the cemetery," he said, his voice shaking. I think there's something wrong with my father's grave." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it," Lucas whispered. "But I saw something. I went to visit his grave earlier today, and well, there was something there. Something that shouldn't be." I could hear the panic in his voice, the same kind of panic I had felt the night before when I saw that figure outside the mausoleum. "Lucas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "take a breath. What exactly did you see?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sound that made my skin crawl, like the faintest of whispers, a voice too low to make out, but there, in the background. "It's him," Lucas finally said, his voice almost inaudible. "It's my father. I saw him, standing by his grave. He's watching me." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "Lucas, that's impossible. Your father he's buried." "I know that," Lucas snapped, his voice sharp with fear. "But I saw him. He was standing there, just staring at me. And it wasn't just once. It's happened twice now. I'm losing my mind." I didn't know what to say. Every instinct I had was telling me this was impossible, that it was just grief playing tricks on Lucas's mind. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen the night before, or the creeping dread that had settled over the cemetery since the funeral. "Lucas," I said slowly, "I'll meet you at the cemetery tomorrow morning. We'll figure this out." He agreed, and I hung up the phone, but the conversation left me with a sinking feeling I couldn't shake. The next morning, I arrived at the cemetery early, before the sun had fully risen. The sky was a dull gray, and a thick fog had rolled in overnight, covering the grounds in a heavy mist. Lucas was already there, pacing near his father's grave, his face pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in days. "I thought I was going crazy," he said as soon as he saw me, his hands shaking. "But I swear, it's real." We walked to the grave together, and as we approached, I noticed something immediately. The soil around the plot looked disturbed, like it had been dug up and hastily filled back in. My heart began to race. This wasn't right. The cemetery grounds crew would have notified me if they'd done any work on the plot, and there hadn't been any reason to disturb it. Lucas knelt by the grave, his hands brushing over the dirt. "Look," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. At first I didn't see it. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw what had him so rattled. There, just beneath the surface of the disturbed soil, were what looked like the tips of fingers, poking through the earth. They were pale, twisted, and too still to be anything alive. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. "What the hell?" Lucas just stood there, staring at the ground in disbelief. "I told you. He's not resting. He's still here." Without thinking, I grabbed a shovel from the maintenance shed nearby and started digging, my heart pounding in my chest. As I unearthed more of the grave, a horrifying realization hit me. This wasn't just a few fingers sticking out of the soil. The entire coffin had been disturbed, as if something, or someone, had tried to claw its way out. Lucas was trembling beside me, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you believe me now?" he whispered. I didn't know what to say. My rational mind was screaming that this couldn't be real, that it was some kind of sick prank, or a grave robbery gone wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Suddenly, a cold wind whipped through the cemetery, and the fog around us seemed to thicken. I heard it then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path behind us. My blood turned to ice. I turned, and there, standing in the mist, was the figure of an old man. It was George Weatherford. His eyes were empty, hollow, and he stared at me with a cold, lifeless gaze. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, just the soft rustling of the wind. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, frozen in terror. Lucas screamed. When I blinked, the figure was gone, vanished into the fog like he had never been there at all. But the grave in front of us told a different story. We left the cemetery that morning, but nothing has been the same since. I locked the gates that night, but I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't keep him out. You see, the dead don't always rest easy. Not here. Not at Crestwood.